Hope you had a lovely day, because we sure have a wonderful show in store for you tonight with a very beautiful and courageous woman, Max Dashu, our special guest. Her website is suppressedhistories.net, or you can check out her incredible artwork at maxdashu.net. That is MAXDASHU.net. She is a teacher of global women's history and heritage through images, and founded the Suppressed Histories Archives in 1970 to research female spheres of power, goddess reverence, shamanic arts, mother right, patriarchy, and the history of domination. So good to have you here this lovely Wednesday. Max, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and I love being on a program called Truth Brigade.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That's a long story, but been actually trying to change it for the last couple years. But anyways, I guess we're supposed to keep this name for a reason. Max, I love your work, by the way. For those of you who are not familiar, you can go to suppressedhistories.net, and just incredible information about just so many things that we have forgotten, I guess, in his story about women's power as life-sustaining arts and technologies, builders, potters, weavers, women elders, seers, shamans, priestesses, healers, medicine women, physicians, etc., athletes, warriors, and rebels. I mean, we so commonly hear, when we're taught history, this really big, strong male warrior, or this war, or that president, or that dictator. And one thing that's certainly been left out is the courage and strength of women.
Yes.
For thousands of years. So, Max, if you could tell us a little bit, before we get started here, about yourself. And I know you grew up in the Midwest and went out to California, but did you always know that something was missing when you were going to school as a young girl?
Well, I did feel that something was missing. I might not have been able to put a name on it at that time. But it just, when I got to college, it really hit me. I mean, I think, growing up in the American football culture does kind of, as a female, there are things, there's something missing there, You could, in my day, the greatest role for a woman was to be a cheerleader.
Yeah.
But
American football culture, I love that.
Yeah. So when I went to college, this was just like the women's movement was just starting, and yet it hadn't really touched academia in any appreciable way. And so when they basically women's history was a joke. And I was taking anthropology, and they were talking about matrilineal societies, but they would bring it up, and they would bring it up in order to tell us it doesn't mean anything. Women have always been subordinated to men. In all human societies, women are beneath men. And I went, matrilineal societies? What's that? And so I started researching, because it was like I just felt that there was this other way of doing culture, the other way of organizing society. And so I began looking for matrilineal societies. And that led me to the indigenous societies, some of which are now patriarchal, others are the most egalitarian cultures on the planet. And as I researched those, there's very little written history, and even less at that time. But in looking up their orature, or the oral traditions, the oral histories that are passed down, there are all these stories. This is where I began to find powerful women. Outside of what we're normally given, which is, what do we get? Queen Elizabeth I, Susan B. Anthony. There's certain usual suspects that continue to always be shot at us. And what about the women who weren't queens? And what about the women among the common people? And there were a lot of indicators, and in the indigenous societies, that those were places where actually you saw women breaking the rules of the dominant societies, and actually having spheres of power, what I came to call female spheres of power. That the society was set up in a way that there was structurally places for women to exert public leadership, spiritual leadership, or just within the fabric of the family, that they had determinative power, decision-making power. They even had diplomatic authority, for example, among the Iroquois nations and some of the other Eastern societies here in North America. They could veto the men's decision to go to the war. In the Iroquois situation, the men could not even discuss going to war until the women forward over the topic to them.
I like that.
Council. So they had a balance of power. And, in various ways it was set up. I mean, women would nominate the male chiefs, and then if there was a chief who was a real screw-up, who was abusive or corrupt or whatever he did that, was wrong, the women had the authority to do what they called knock the horns off the chief. And they could remove him. And so that's a very different social model. This is not pie-in-the-sky fantasy. This is a different way of doing things. And here in the U.S., we were taught that, our civilization, I mean, you think women have it bad here, you should look over there. And they're still doing that with us. Now they're saying, oh, but those Muslim women, not like here. But we still have, globally, not such a great proportion of women in government and, in corporate boards and as talk show hosts or, anything you want, movie producers, any powerful positions you want to list in this society. The female representation after all this time is not that hot, in fact.
Yeah,
so we have American women have this illusion.
I mean, in regards to what you just brought up, she asked, what do you think of political women like Hillary Clinton and Condi Rice? Do you think these political women channel any archetypes of womanhood, or do they just look female?
I think they have to play by the rules set by the white men.
Yeah. And
so that really constrains them, and you can see a pattern in the so-called West of the women who do get into those roles, and you've got, not just the West, Indira Gandhi and Golda Meir and Margaret Thatcher, and you get some women who are pretty fiercely upholding the militarist views of the dominant order. And Hillary Clinton did that too, and she felt that she had to. I don't know what she would have done, otherwise, but that was, I mean, that's the paradigm. That's how it's set up. So what I'm trying to do is bring forward knowledge about other societies where instead of fighting against an order that's skewed heavily to the masculine, and in the case of the U.S., heavily toward the white, as far as spheres of power are concerned, and look at other societies where you had organically integrated ways of women exerting creativity, power, leadership, spiritual vision, healing, within the way the society was set up. They didn't have to go against the way things were. They could go with the flow because the flow was set up for them to be there.
Okay. Now, do you think it's always been this way, or was there a time where perhaps it was more balanced?
No, I don't think it's always been that way, and that's why I'm pointing to some of these egalitarian Aboriginal societies, because they are living testimony that it doesn't have to be always this way. And they also represent a much wider history. We can look at a lot of places on the planet and say, well, now it's really male-dominated. But 500 years ago, I mean, some parts of West Africa, for example, a lot of places on the planet, changes have happened. So one of the things that I keep trying to clarify is that there's no one chronology. A lot of times women will say, well, patriarchy started 5,000 years ago. But it depends where you are. If you're in ancient Iraq, then yeah. But if you're in Ecuador or in Malawi or a lot of other places, then no, much, much, much later. And sometimes not until the European conquest. So it's
what do you think happened? I mean, how did we fall into this patriarchal dominated society so easily?
I don't know if it was easy. It was a long process, and it happened a lot of different ways. So, there's a lot of theories, and all of them have, it's kind of like, there may not be one cause other than just straight up greed and human perversity. The way I look at patriarchy is that it's a series of overlays of cultural structures that get built up that favor one group over another. It's based on dominance. And so it's, of course, males or females, but it's also a class-ranked system, usually. It, can be ethnically based as well. There can be aspects of religion that come into it. So I see layers upon layers. One layer can be, well, it's some long ago time, in groups of people fighting against each other to control the best land, and the most military group would win and take over the river valleys, let's say, our very desirable land. So they got taken over, and they became our first-ranked societies for humans. So that happened. And in the context of all of the raising up of war, women's status fell. And there's a variety of ways that it fell. One is that the captives of war were female. Males would be killed. So it was women and children who were taken captive. So this idea that women were chattel came along. And that I think that's one really important piece. Another important
so they pretty much destroyed entire colonies or civilizations of people that way. And then separated
and that's been an ongoing process that has spread like a cancer, and it's now spread over the entire planet.
Yeah.
Until you've got groups that are still indigenous groups who are now fighting to retain the few lands that are left to them because they want to build a dam, or they want to log the forest, or they're drilling for oil. And so there's no place on Earth left that's safe in that way, because this dominance paradigm and the greed, because a lot of it is like resource extraction. Let's just swallow it up into the consumer society. So those are aspects that come in also when I look at the origins of patriarchy, because it has to do with control of resources and control of inheritance and reproductive power. It's like, how do we determine kinship, and who determines where the property goes? If one group of people is accumulating property and wealth, then you've got men saying, well, I want this to go to my sons, and not to go to a larger collective kin group that's based on mother right. And so in order to get that, what we call a patrilineal system, where descent goes in the male line, the only way you can have that system is by controlling female sexuality and female self-determination.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
That
hit on
is
a big
where,
one.
Yeah, and that's where the sexual double standard arises, which is that's such a key part of any patriarchal society. And so you've got all kinds of violence being used and force being brought to bear, force in a really brutal way, and then as time goes on, also more subtle forms of coercion on women to make them obey those rules.
Yes,
virgin before
do this
married,
or else, or give us your property or else. And it seems to me, though, that there has to have, and maybe it was a long process, but there must have been a time where we kind of lost our will to fight back, where it was easy to sell out to the people with the guns and the gold.
I think times of crisis, and Naomi Klein is right about this. I don't know if you've heard of her book on the shock doctrine. But when you're in the middle of the crisis of war or famine, invasion, whatever it is, then people get afraid. And it's easy for a group of really determined people who want to take over to do that at those times. And so if people are afraid of invasion, then they will surrender their power to some general who installs himself as a warlord. And once either the invasion happens and is driven, or it's driven out, but if it's driven out, then they're stuck with this warlord. And he starts taxing them, and he starts taking their daughters, and he's going to add them to his little staff of concubines there, sexual slavery, and all these different kinds of coercion. But because we're looking over such a large amount of time, one of the things that happens is people get separated from their indigenous lands. When you look at people of European descent, we're a long way off here in America from those core ways. And Europeans, even though they've become industrialized and all of that, they have still some of the ancestral megalithic temples down the road from them. And so there's like more of a connection to that past. So that's one aspect of it that I think is important. Another is that we've been talking mostly about women and what happened to women, but there's also ways that entire peoples get demoralized. And I think that the dominance-based systems take away from men as well. In not men as a group over women as a group, not thinking of it in that way, but thinking of how many males are also subordinated inside these dominance-based systems. Yes. So, they're pushed around by schoolyard bullies when they're kids. They are, forced into the army, or all these things happen. And
gladiator rings.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just like, and shame is used a lot to pull them into line with that dominance ethic. And then, of course, they act it out on others. They learn to act it out on others. So that when people grow up in a society where violence and domination is the norm, they adapt to it. They think, well, this is the best I can do. And when that norm is built up over a long period where at first it's maybe just in the emergency, but then later it's like, well, I remember my grandfather had this, and, it goes on for such a long time that they begin to even just lose hope that there's any other way of humans being. And that's how we were taught. I was taught, you were taught, that the way things are is just how it's always been, and that's the default human condition.
Yeah.
But that's not true. And this is a lot of what I'm doing in the Suppressed Histories Archives is pulling forward all of this really inspirational, gorgeous art and cultural heritage that is not in that vein of things. That creates beauty, and that you see a different view of humanity, and especially of women, so that you can see women in leading roles, including even in some of these societies that are fighting for their life. And I have a whole show about female shamans and prophets who led movements of indigenous people to fight back against invasion and conquest. And so even in those kinds of contexts, you can see that these other ways, in fact, sometimes they kind of rear up at that time because maybe the women are getting pushed back inside their own society. And you can see some examples of that in parts of Africa where, nevertheless, when the Europeans come in and start invading and conquering, it is very often women diviners and shamans who rise up and lead these revolutionary movements. And so I think that women are demoralized, and most people at this point are demoralized because everybody looks around and it's a mess. They've made a terrible mess of things, and it's got this momentum behind it. And so we need to re-inspire ourselves of thinking about how things could be different and how we can make change. But we need something to go on. We need some kind of spiritual medicine. And part of that is to be able to actually taste these other realities that I've been talking about.
Okay, so it's I mean, both men and women have certainly been suppressed, their innate states, their innate abilities. Do you think it was, I've heard of times where it was more female-dominated as well, which I think is probably equally as destructive as what we're living now in the patriarchal.
Can you name one society that was like that? I can't.
Yeah, no, that's why I said I've heard of. Yeah. So I'm not really sure, but
here's what happened.
You just say it. The pendulum swung, and supposedly it was, one way, then went the other way, and here we are back the other way. I mean, of course, I can't verify any of that at all, but what you show through your slides, your presentations, seems to be a little bit more balanced than what we're told.
Well, I think what happens is we say, okay, this is a patriarchal society, so meaning that it's males dominating females. It also means other kinds of domination. So they reverse that out and they say, well, we can't have matriarchy because that would just be the same thing, only women would be doing it to men. So the terms, there's certain implied parallelism in the terminology that does not exist in the historical record.
And most people would say, well, the queen, that's a matriarchal society, right?
No, it's not.
Exactly.
No, it's in 1,000 ways it's not. I mean, first of all, she's a figurehead at this point. And, you know, we did finally have Margaret Thatcher. They had their first female prime minister. But the government is still entirely dominated by men, and so is the economic system, the legal system, the medical, the universities, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
So, yeah. But I think that, you know, if we just look, we have to look at actual societies. Like we can look at the archaeological record, and we don't see any evidence of men being oppressed at any point in the archaeological record. We do find examples of egalitarian societies. I know everybody's house is, you know, nobody's house is a whole lot bigger. They don't have a lot more stuff than each other. And there are no signs of women's oppression in some of those old Neolithic societies. You know, there's no signs of a military establishment. You know, the kind of weapons they have are for hunting, you know, but not for, you know, heavy-duty warfare. And if there was warfare, I mean, I'm not saying humans are perfect. They can fight with each other. Hand-to-hand combat, you know, maybe some arrows.
Yeah.
But, so it's just that there's this idea that somehow there has to be domination, and we have to step out of the whole paradigm of domination. The opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy. The opposite, and we can't, that's too polarized. We have to look and say, what is another paradigm that is completely different from that? And that is where we find tons of historical evidence for societies that were egalitarian. It's not that there weren't gender differences, but that they weren't oppressive. And you can even have that borderline between males and females is permeable. So you've got trans people who want to become women or want to become men being able to cross over the line. You know, it's like, okay, I'm going to dress my hair, you know, some guy says, I'm going to dress my hair as a woman, I'm going to weave, and I want to work in the fields. I don't want to, you know, go out there and herd cattle or whatever it is, you know. So that's where looking at the Aboriginal societies is really illuminating, because not all of them are egalitarian, not at this point in history, but you can see some examples, and the ones that are the most egalitarian tend to have descent in the female line for the reason I explained before, which is if you're going to have a system based on descent in the male line, then you've got to have gender inequality to enforce it. Because there's a proverb, mama's baby, papa's maybe. You know, and academics would call the male line the agnatic line, which means the line that you don't really know. Because, you know, you can't ensure that, there's no way to ensure that except by sequestrating women and forcing them into very rigid sexual double standard. Yeah. So that's why matrilineage is an indicator. It's not a guarantee, but it is an indicator that's correlated with sexual equality. You know, and there are matrilineal societies that are still around that have become male-dominated, and they still have kept the lineage, but they've got, you know, men taking multiple wives and having authority over them or beating them, and, you know, things devolve. And that gets back to that whole story of how does this happen.
Yeah. Do you think religion has something to do with it? Because I know, I mean, even just here on the show, if we talk about topics like this, or say the divine feminine or anything like that, we automatically are equated to Satanists, Luciferian worship, Whore of Babylon, all of these, you know, mythical, biblical type, you know, we basically get stoned to death.
Yeah. Well, that's an old story, and it's not a religious universal. But of course, we look at the history of Europe and in Western Asia and some other places, you do have religious repression being what I would call an intensification of a male-dominant system that already exists. So, you know, it's not maybe in those places it's not the first thing that happens, But further down the way, it's a way of internally colonizing women and making them think that divinity can only be seen as masculine, and also that women are a special case. Men are the main event. They are the default form of human, and women are this secondary group over at the side who have special rules and are less than. And so religion, in a lot of places, has taught that, institutional religion. And again, I would differentiate that from the egalitarian societies where you can have religion that would have female leadership. They may have goddesses or other female spirits that are important in their system, so that it's not setting up man to be God, man over woman, you know. So, but on the other hand, having said that, there are cases of Aboriginal societies where religion does seem to have been the means of knocking women out of socially central power. So in the Amazon basin, for example, there are a lot of stories in the oral histories about once upon a time women had these ceremonies and they had the sacred flutes or whatever it was, the regalia, and then the men took over and they violently repressed the women. In some of the stories it says they killed all the women except little girls. And then they instituted this new male-dominant system. So you've got oral histories talking about that, and you do have various ways that women have been driven out, not just in industrial or imperial societies, but also in some Aboriginal societies, from religious leadership. And so that is why I say that this is so complex. Because we have to look at war, we have to look at class society, we have to look at religion, economics, you know, and the whole way that the descent system works, because that has so much to do with the way that land and goods and property are controlled. And so those are the kind of things, along with sex, that humans are capable of not acting very nicely, to put it in plain terms, you know, because,
well said.
You know, satisfying cravings, whether it's food, water, land, property, or, you know, in the case of rape and forced marriage and things like that, sexual slavery, you have sex also functioning as a good that can be acquired and that can be coerced. And so that is a really important part of the story also. And looking at
shut down people's sex and you can basically rule an entire civilization, well, a whole earth.
At this point,
maybe
the whole
even
earth.
Beyond.
I mean, you know, I think it's important to recognize that there's groups like the Hopi and there's the Winnemem Wintu and there's these societies that are still around, but they're so threatened because, you know, the devouring corporate behemoth is breathing down their necks and threatening to take away their land, flood it, poison it with oil or mercury or whatever.
Yeah.
And so
what little land they're allowed to even, you know, stay on anymore.
Exactly. Like I was just reading today, and they have Brazil, where we just elected, there's a female socialist president, but she just signed off on a dam, the Belo Monte Dam. It's going to be the third largest dam on the planet, and it's going to flood the lands of the Kayapo and a lot of other Indian peoples along the Xingu River in Brazil. And so we're fighting that because this is, a lot of prophecies say that when, you know, the Aboriginal people go, that's it, the planet's done. And that sort of seems like how, you know, that's how things are looking more and more, because who's protecting the forests and the waters, you know?
Yeah.
And
it's almost like they have to go undercover nowadays. I mean, like, well, here, the Hopis and such, they can't really talk about their roots and have to kind of fit in just to at least, you know, spread the seed for when they are flooded out entirely.
Well, or they talk, but they don't have the huge microphone system that the mass media does, and nobody hears them. They're shouting, and they're not mic'd, and nobody can hear them.
You know, something else they don't have, they don't even have the internet in the places they're allowed to dwell.
Well, some of them do. I mean, that's the interesting thing is you're seeing a lot of indigenous people who have been forced into the larger society, who have gone and gotten degrees. Some of them have become lawyers to fight in the courts for the land rights. And so, there's some of the medicine women are online on Facebook in California. So it's true that some people are not and others are, but there's a whole level of activism because we're globally connected now that we can do, to start putting ourselves into these networks and looking for them and finding out, there are petitions to sign, for example, to protest this dam in Brazil. And that's something we can do because that's the lungs of the planet. It's not just the Kayapo who are going to suffer. It's everybody. We're already having global warming.
I think it's ridiculous that man thinks they control Mother Nature to begin with, but that's another story. Begging man or signing petitions. I mean, has that really ever worked?
Well, there are some cases where it has, and going through the courts is part of it as well. I mean, I think that only going to the courts or only raising public protest, you have to have a combination of strategies. I got a thing today. Somebody sent me, the African woman in Paris sent me this link to the Gaia Foundation, I think they're called, who has a story about women who are called the Makaji, and they're Venda women in South Africa who are guardians of sacred places. And so this company came in and broke their sacred rock and was going to try to build chalets up and down the sacred part of their river where they had their ceremonies. And they fought it in court, and they won. And I don't think they would have if there had not been also a public outcry where you publicize this, And I think that part of what we have to build is a movement of coalitions so that it's not women's rights over here and indigenous land rights over there, but when you see how they come together and how, supporting the indigenous woman actually supports women's rights as a whole, really it gives us wisdom and knowledge of different ways of living and living examples of another way of doing things besides, the Pope.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it is very daunting. I'm not trying to minimize that.
So it's a combination of things. I mean, so I guess essentially we kind of have to at least be somewhat in the system to be successful. I mean, as far as taking some of that back or I mean, I don't know. I guess I might have a jaded point of view in regards to what we call the system. I kind of gave up in having any hope in that, but it is nice to hear that there are some success stories.
Well, I mean, there's I understand what you're saying. And yet I do feel that with all that's going on, we have to find a way to fight for the right. And I don't know. I'm not here to tell anybody how they need to do that. I mean, if you're living on the land, then you might be able to provide food to people in the inner city. I mean, there's a lot of ways that can go. But I do think the principle of getting away of this idea of I'm just going to take care of my stuff and everything's going to be okay, we have to be connected to these larger things, because otherwise it will come. It's like the indigenous people on the land. They were there, and then it came along and bit them in the butt because this monster was growing outside. And so we have to find ways to overturn those dominant systems because they'll get us. I mean, they just will. So I don't know the answer, but I think that we need to be searching.
I'm sure it's a combination of efforts. I mean, we all have our place, and maybe some are more comfortable in that, and maybe some are more comfortable in the land providing the food and medicine. But let me ask you this. There was a few questions in the forum for you, and I'll read this one first. Do you know a specific event in past history where a female was a hero model? Would be nice to know some away from the Bible stories we're told.
Really? Oh, yeah. Well, there's a whole lot of them. And the Women's Power DVD, I have a bunch of them in there, including women who, fought to defend their homelands. Joan of Arc is the best-known example, and she really was. I mean, she saved France from a 100-year English invasion. And she did it through prophecy. And they almost, they did burn her as a witch, but even in her early times, they thought she was a witch because she had these powers. But there are so many different examples. A lot of these are going to be names people don't know, but one of the better-known ones is Queen Nanny of the Maroons, who was the hero of Jamaican Africans, who the Maroons were people who fled from slavery and went up inland into the highlands of Jamaica, and they founded independent free societies. And their leader, the most effective of all the leaders they had, was an Ashanti woman who was known as Queen Nanny. There was, there's Lozen of the Apache Nation. There's Teresa de Cabora, who's not very well known in the United States, although she came here toward the end of her life, who was another one of these medicine women who fought back. She was actually the forerunner of the Mexican Revolution, and she was a healer. She was like somebody who could look into your eyes and lay hands on you and cure you of cancer. And she had like 10,000 people camped out on the ranch where she lived because the Indian people in western Mexico heard about her like a prophet. And they all came streaming to her and heard her speaking about the civil rights of Indians and how they had rights to their land and that they should stand up for their rights because that was a time of oppression. And I'm just reading some examples here off my webpage because I have a lot of examples from the Rebel Shamans slide presentation that I do. Yeah. But there are other examples of female heroes, also females who were founders of societies. And you have monuments to the ancestral women in a lot of cultures. And basically I'm trying to just track back what are the authentic heritages, the powerful heritages that women have in Europe, because that is something that the witch hunts devastated and just shredded. Did never succeed in entirely destroying them, but this is something a lot of people are looking to recovery, is what were their own ancestral spiritual ways. And
what is a witch? Really? I mean, I think obviously that term has certainly been demonized.
Oh, yeah.
And, so why don't we talk about what a witch really is?
Well, the word is an old Anglo-Saxon word, and it has corresponding terms in other Germanic languages. For example, in Dutch, there was a staff, a wand, really, called a Wickenrode. And Wiccan is one of the forms of the word for witch. And so this was a divination staff, like a magic wand that we still see in the fairy tales. Yes, you're right about the demonization. So what we have to do is we have to go back to the records, the old early medieval records that talk about witches. And the thing is, we're dealing with a lot of different names. Our word witch is one, and it comes from a root that means to turn, to twist, to twine. So it's tied up with the idea of the spinner and the fates, for one thing. And also with divination, and it's related to other Germanic words meaning to consecrate. And so that's that one word. But then we can look at all the other European languages, and you find other concepts that tie in together with prophecy and knowledge. For example, in Russian, the primary word for witch is vedma, or Polish and some of the other Slavic names also have to do with this same meaning of knower, from a root word that means to see or to know. And so you have forms of that in Old Celtic that are related, actually, to Vedma. So in Gaulish, you've got widlua, and also meaning seer. And we've got words meaning truth-sayer, or prophet, or diviner, or inspired, or visionary woman, lot caster. You've got the Vuller or the Vala of ancient or medieval, rather, Scandinavia. And so you have basically female shamans that are attested not that long ago. 1,000 years ago, they are still active in Norway and Iceland. And so that's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't know. And then there's a whole other group of names, witch titles I call them, that have to do with medicine and healing. And so some of them mean things like herb woman and a woman who chants over herbs, woman who ties knots, women who give potions. And then you've got negative names for those women because as Christianity comes in, the priesthood was fighting against, these were basically their rivals in religion, was the old pagan leadership. And these shamans and herb chanters, they were saying, oh, no, they're praying to the devil. And so that's where this whole demonized notion originates, is this idea that witches worship the devil, that pagan goddesses were somehow the devil, and so everything gets redefined.
So we need men to keep us in line, right?
Well, yes, and also because, once again, we've got a lot of polarities active there. It's also indigenous versus foreign external cultures that were brought in first by the Romans and then by the Christianized empire. So this is where the church was modeled on the structures of the empire. That's where the word diocese was borrowed from Roman imperial administration. And so people don't know that. But you've got this intense attempt to take away the folk tradition and replace it with a religion that came from somewhere else. And then all of this is being done in the name of a priesthood, which after the first few centuries of Christianity, that priesthood had been made into an all-male authority. Women were barred from priesthood in that institutional church. And very often there were small ethnic groups that still had women acting as priestesses among the Arabs or among the Bretons in France, the Celtic French. But those were fought down by the 600s or so. You don't see that anymore. It's except among heretics, another demonized group. So there's this process of cultural takeover that involves basically what's happening is they're de-indigenizing European culture.
Yes.
And they're doing it through a process of repression, which at first they're not, burning at the stake is not that widespread. You've got laws about it that begin to appear.
Yeah, instead we just steal their children and charge them falsely and lock them up in prison or institutions, right?
Well, you had the dungeons, or else you had other forms. The main pattern, because there weren't that many jails really either for the amount. Here's the thing: if we're looking at 7th century Europe, 9th century Europe, the church is swimming in a sea of pagan culture. The festivals, calendars, the names for the places on the landscape, all of these things are drenched in the old religion. So there was no way they could put everybody in jail at that point in time. But what they did is they would interfere, they would burn down a sacred grove, they would try to fill in a sacred spring, they would chop down trees, and there's a lot of records of this, early missionaries like Boniface chopping down trees that were, old-growth trees that had been revered maybe for 1,000 years.
Yes.
And so they were doing those things, and then they were also, at that period, attacking the leaders, the priestesses and the priests, or the shamans, and they were enslaving them. They were flogging them. Sometimes they would put them into exile or brand them. And so most of that, at that period, you don't have burning of the stake as a primary punishment, but you do have violence being used to stamp out old religious ways.
Yeah.
Later, a couple centuries later, you have the bishops kind of have gotten the upper hand. They've at least nominally Christianized the population. The old folk festivals are going on, and what's happening is instead of calling their deity by the old name, they've kind of smuggled them in as a saint. And so there's all these different saint cults all over Europe where they're carrying the statue in procession and they're singing the old songs and they're substituting the names with Christian names. So it's kind of a hybrid society. And this is what went on in Europe for hundreds of years. But you do have the Inquisition coming along and beginning to look at things, and already in the early days of the Inquisition, they're not burning the people at the stake quite yet in the 1200s when this is founded. But by the late 1300s, they're starting to look in that direction. And by the 1400s, witch hunts are starting to spread under church auspices. So you've got inquisitors and sentencing witches to death. But it's not only the church, and this is an important point that a lot of people miss. The church, even when they sentenced someone to death, they handed the person over to the secular ruler, whoever that was. And that was who carried out the execution. But the secular rulers were doing executions of their own. So in the 11th century, you've got records of counts who are burning witches at the stake. You've got records in the 1200s of city magistrates who are beginning, maybe not always to burn witches. Sometimes they did. Other times they would find them or throw them out of town. And so this repression it's like a low-level simmer. And by the 1400s, 1500s, and then really building toward the end of that century, going into the 1600s, the whole thing catches fire in this witch craze that has been created over this process of time. And then it becomes uncontrollable, and accusations are flying, and the whole thing is accelerated by the fact that they've adopted judicial torture. And this is something that the Inquisition reintroduced from old Roman law in the 12th century. And it is something that the states very quickly adopted. And so the state-run courts were burning more witches than the church, although people think of the Inquisition. But the Inquisition was the one that provided the ideology. And what they did is they took the Roman law and they demonized the old deities as the devil. And so this concept of devil worship that was applied to memories of the gatherings, the shamanic gatherings of people on the mountaintops where they would have a fire, they'd dance, they'd feast, and this would be their festival. That all got, and the idea of witches flying by night, the shamanic flight, also gets worked into this, and a new legend, a new demonological legend is evolved that becomes a basis for the repression. But now they're saying that the witches gather in order to harm people. And so this is what turned the tide, because between the torture trials and this idea of the harm doer, this made people afraid. And they heard all these rumors and stories spread like wildfire about all the awful things the witches were supposedly doing. And that was where the thing just got out of control. The fact that they're torturing people, and then if you were going to be burned, okay, to stop the torture, you'd finally say whatever, most people would, whatever the torturers wanted. And so then, in order to be given the small blessing, the small mercy of being strangled before you were burned alive, then they would make you confess. And so everybody would see you standing up there saying, yes, I did it, or the trial record would be read out to the avid audience of people who would come to see this burning, and the person would nod their head and they go, see, she did it. But that was why she did it.
Do you think there really were, let's say, witches that were gathering together to harm others?
No. This is a whole invention, and it had its origins in old blood libels that go back to the late Roman days, in late antiquity. And these were accusations that were originally made against the Jews and against heretical Christian groups. So the Manichaeans and the Carpocratians, and I can't even remember the name of all these different sects. The word heretic, by the way, comes from a Greek word meaning choice. It originally meant schools of thought in philosophy. But with this sort of mono-doctrine that took over in the late Roman Empire, where the whole thing was made into, the whole empire was Christianized, and they outlawed all other religions. It became this very authoritarian model. Then you were no longer allowed to have freedom of belief. And that had been a pagan custom, and there's numerous testimonies from early Christians talking about the tolerance of the pagans. But the bishops were saying, no, you got to believe the way we do, and this is our interpretation of the teachings of Yeshua of Nazareth, and you have got to follow our interpretations, or you're a heretic. And they were executing people for it, as well as burning books. So that accusation was first put out against, groups that, nowadays we would look at them and say, well, they weren't They weren't doing those terrible things. They weren't eating babies alive, which was one of the accusations that was raised against the witches. So, it's a long, very convoluted story, but the demonization can be, this is what I'm going to be doing in the book, is just laying out the development of it and all the twists and turns it took over the centuries and the way things shifted as more and more people were separated from their folk culture and from their wise women until they got to the point in the 1500s, 1600s, where they were ready to fork them over to be burned. And a lot of the talking about scripts of domination in the society, there were peasant revolts going on, and people were being thrown off their land, just like we were saying about indigenous people. The great lords were doing what they called enclosures, and they were taking away the commons, the forests that people had been able to get their firewood and hunt rabbits or whatever, and this was all being taken away from them. So there was a lot of crisis and war and emergency and plague at that time, and people were looking for scapegoats.
Yes, someone to blame.
Yeah.
Okay. That feels right, what you're saying, as far as the witches and what they supposedly did or didn't do. But I guess the way I kind of look at it nowadays, I would just call a witch a healer.
A healer, a seer, a counselor,
a shaman.
A shaman, right? So there's been a lot of change. And I will say one other thing about shaman, because if you look at the world traditions around shamans, there is always this part of people that kind of goes, well, you know what? He has those powers. He could use them for ill as well as for good. And so there has been a tendency on a global level, and it's not universal, but you do find it in a lot of places, to accuse the shaman of maybe harming somebody. And so, when I began this research, I thought, well, it's just the church, because there was so much evidence of repression by the religious hierarchy in order to bring society into line with what they thought it should be. But I can see also that there's this other thing where people are kind of like they want to blame somebody, and it's sort of it's the shadow side of magical thinking, I guess, and so if somebody dies, of tuberculosis or something, then there has to be a human cause. That somebody did that to you. And so I've seen examples in researching for the Woman Shaman DVD. I did a lot more research than I already had done on shaman traditions in different places, and I found examples, for example, in Western North America, where in Oregon, Washington, different places like that, where shamans were being accused of causing harm. Yeah. And so that's out there. That's another thing to consider, and that's why I say that this is complex.
Yeah, and there's lots of sorcerers in the White House and many other places in power, but let's point the finger somewhere else, of course. There's a few more questions in the chat for you, Max. Okay. She asks, let's do this one first. Okay, Dear Max, I recently researched a Hollywood actress who had basically lied about her birthplace in her International Movie Database profile, claiming she was born in Salem, Massachusetts, when in fact she was actually a Burbank native. She also lied about her birth date. So why do women feel the need to channel witch lore to create an air of mystique and intrigue about them, suggesting they are Salem witches, instead of plain old boring Burbank Anglinos?
I just think people, there are always going to be people out there who are out to promote themselves. And, that is something that, I don't know, I think it's a certain breed of attention-seeking groups, groupie-seeking people that do that. I mean, it's not everybody who wants to claim being some powerful Salem witch. There are other archetypes out there that are probably more profitable. But the whole Salem thing is strange to me anyway, because it's, people always talk about Salem, and yet that was like probably that is without question the most famous case of a witch hunt in North America. There were others, and there were actually more witches burned in Connecticut than there were in Massachusetts.
Oh, wow.
The Salem craze is just really well known. A lot has been written about it. There's been plays and movies and whatnot. But all through New England, you had these witch persecutions. There's a woman named Carol Carlson that wrote a really great history of these witch hunts, not just Salem, that was called The Devil in the Shape of a Woman. And, she just basically documents how the witch hunts were related to fear of female power, and she shows statistically from the records how women accused of witchcraft were much more likely to be women who either had property or stood to inherit property. And so, this was a way of leveraging women, leveraging getting their hands on property, because confiscation was one of the things that had grown up in Europe as a way of punishing witches, is that they would take all of their property. And there were examples in England also of that kind of witch accusation. So it's more complex than that. And there were also witch hunts in Mexico and in South America. You have the Inquisition. This is one place where the Inquisition really did do a lot of witch hunts, although they weren't primarily burning them at the stake. Early on a little bit they did that. But it was more of an ongoing form of repression, the Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisitions in Central and South America, that were basically, once again, trying to stamp out American Indian religions, African diaspora religions, and those were among the groups that really caught their attention. And you also have examples of the Spanish and Portuguese settlers practicing folk magic or other kinds of forbidden things, forbidden as far as the church was concerned, not anything harmful really. And so those people came under fire, and there's some really interesting records. I have, in fact, one of the chapters that's in the Secret History of the Witches link on my website is an article on colonial hunts in South America. And it basically lays out how the Inquisition did this and the ways they went after African women and men, and the ways they went after Venezuelan and Peruvian Indian people, especially women. And so that's an aspect of the repression that people don't usually know about, which is that Europe exported witch hunting to its colonies. And it became another weapon in the colonial arsenal to, subjugate the indigenous people that were there, and a way of forcing them into the church as well.
Okay, let me ask you this, because I guess she didn't only lie about where she was born. She lies about her birth date and sheds off half a dozen years or so. And, so that brings to mind, why are we, why is it such an insult to ask a woman her age? And,
I know.
I had a birthday last week, and, oh, how old are you? And, they would almost get slapped upside the head by some innocent bystander. Oh, you never ask a woman her age. What is that all about?
And a lot of women, they do that to themselves. They're ashamed of their age. They try to hide it. They lie about it. Well, it's because their value is measured by age and beauty. Are they, a sexual commodity on the market or not? And so the older you get, then it doesn't happen with men, but that's the sexual double standard. Because women are judged according to, once they're over 40, well, then they're over. And men
but if you're over 40 and you lie and say you're 30, I mean...
well, it's totally stupid, but, that's one of the conventions of this culture that I always just found ridiculous. A lot, I know that women go through a lot of pain over this. They really suffer, some of them, because they take it seriously, just like they're really freaking out if they break their fingernail.
Yeah,
it's like,
absolutely.
So,
well, this kind of leads into the next questions that were on the chat or in the forum here. They ask, can you talk about the concept of the crone or the wise old woman, and why is our society still so obsessed with the cult of eternal youth? Is there any society of times past where older women were given the respect they deserve?
Oh, yes, I think there were, and there even are. There are still cases of that around. But, again, it's going back to this idea of, well, two things. One is the commodification of female beauty and women as sex objects. So we got that out of the way. But then there's also the flip side of that is to demonize old women. Usually what happens is that old women, always happens that old women are experienced. They've been through it, they've seen it all. And a lot of times old women become more radical, as Gloria Steinem has pointed out. Because, they may have in their youth...
we don't care anymore. We can finally speak our mind, right?
Yeah, well, women will, in their youth, may buy into the social legends that, this is how you're supposed to be, and if you do this, then everything will work out. But then, their marriage may fail, and, their husband may run off with the kids, or all kinds of things happen, or they get turned out of a job because at a certain age they're not considered as desirable as, a nice young 23-year-old or something. And so they see their own value in society fall. And, of course, it makes them angry, but that anger is one of the things that leads to the demonization is tied up with that because old women protest, or at least in some societies, some women do. But that's considered a threat. That's considered bad because it's bad form for them to not just accept the fact that they are being devalued as humans. They should just go along with the program. And so this crone archetype does, at least for Euroculture, have a relationship with the whole witch hunt thing. And the old woman was the single group most likely, especially poor old women, to be accused of witchcraft in Europe. And so the way that the witch craze would go is it would start out accusing old women, one old woman, then some others, and then gradually as the craze built, it would spread to other people because they were using torture, and people were being forced to name under torture who were the other witches that they went to the so-called sabbat with, right? And so more and more wealthy people and more men would be swept into this circle of accusation. And that would eventually cut-off switch would happen because the judges started to become more skeptical at a certain point because there were so many men or so many well-off burghers who were being accused, and then the hunt would stop. And then the whole process would repeat itself again. So this idea of the old woman as a threat, as a danger, is very characteristic of a lot of patriarchal societies. The idea that she does have power. There's some power in that wisdom and that experience that she has that's recognized, but it's considered to be a bad thing because power is not considered appropriate in any female in a strongly patriarchal system. And so what you then have is all these stories about old women doing all kinds of horrible things and, being sorceresses or whatever.
Putting kids in the oven, right?
Yeah. And so this is where symbol and story have a huge role, and this is still true of us now, even though we've got movies or whatever, is they have this huge role in shaping values and social consensus and behaviors. And so when you have all these stories building up over time and creating this concept of this very negative concept of the crone, it has an impact because this is what you're teaching children. And so that fear and that despising of old women is something that's being fed to people in all these different layers. Whereas, on the other hand, the warrior hero is the good thing, the one that we're all for, even though those are the people, for the most part, who are creating the most damage in the world.
They're revered and, they're looked upon as heroes, but, the little old lady, right?
Yeah.
She's the dangerous one.
and the flip side of it is that she's just of no account, and nobody listens to her. I mean, I had my mom told me when she reached her 70s that people would just act like you weren't there. She would go into a store and she would talk to somebody and they would just not even respond.
Wow.
And she stopped being asked to parties because other women who weren't widows had, they were worried about their husband straying. And so, you had to have a man with you, and most older women don't because men usually die earlier, in order to validate you as a social entity. So there's a whole way that that old women get dropped from the center of society. And so, the crone is there's a whole complex of reasons how that came to be.
What can we do about it, though? I mean, there's some talk on the text chat here. Somebody mentioned crow's feet, and that's like a perfect example of how we, once again, are demonizing or putting down or putting to shame age, which I believe represents wisdom. I mean, what about little things like, instead of calling them crow's feet, calling them smile lines? Because I don't know about you, but I'm certainly proud of mine and all 15 of my gray hairs.
Yeah.
Is there something that we can do in society or in our community to kind of turn that around?
Well, I think that Carol Christ, I don't know if you know her work, but she's done a lot of goddess theology work, and she has this great insight in which she says symbol systems cannot be removed. They have to be replaced. And so
we replace crow's feet with smile lines, right?
Well, or you just, if you take the sting out of the crow's feet. I mean, crows also have been demonized. So, there's a lot of different ways we can go about this. But we have to have new stories, new symbols, new models, and in some cases, a lot of us are bringing back very, very old ones because they are rich and full of beauty, and there's a lot there. If you look back to the old goddess traditions, or right here in North America, the stories of the old woman. I'm trying to come to a room where the ice cream truck is not going to be heard here. But I think we have to re-envision this, and this is for our artists and our musicians and our filmmakers, that we have to recreate new cultural worlds or revive old ones that give us other ways of envisioning things, because actually a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, the archetypes of crones and all of this stuff, is very flattened culture. It's very stereotypical. And we have to restore the richness and the texture, and there's all kinds of ways of being a powerful old woman. And some of them are, the wise old grandmother who's, kind eyes and, takes care of the children, and we shouldn't turn our nose up at that just because that's the only form that has really been allowed as a positive archetype of old women in this society. And then there's the defiant, radical old woman. When I'm an old woman, I shall wear purple and, stand up to the powers that be. That archetype, and there's a lot of good examples there. So we have to have a whole spectrum instead of one stereotype.
Max, I want to thank you so much for your time and sharing your wisdom with us tonight. You've been such a delight. And I thank you all for joining us tonight. What a pleasure to have her here tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.